Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Carson. I am a chaplain and captain in the United States Air Force, and some of you might recognize me from the last season of Call to Create, where I spoke a little bit about being the first woman endorsed by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a military chaplain. I'm so privileged to be back for season 5, interviewing the one and only McKay Coppins. McKay, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jenna. It's an honor, and I'm excited to talk to you.
So I joke that I have a professional platonic crush on you because in 2021, when I read your article in The Atlantic, The Most American Religion, I thought, I want to be like McKay. I want to be able to write and speak like this and engage people in a relatively non-biased way. We can't be completely free of bias, right? But the way you write about your own religion for a secular audience really inspires me. And if listeners have been hiding under a rock and don't know who you are, I want to read your bio. So, McKay Coppins is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics, religion, and national affairs. He is the author of The Wilderness, a book about the battle for the future of the Republican Party. And he is the author of the New York Times best-selling biography, Romney, A Reckoning. He has been a visiting fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. He won the Aldo Beckman Award from the White House Correspondents Association for his coverage of the Trump presidency, and the Wilbur Award for Religion Journalism. He lives near Washington, D.C. with his wife and children. McKay, I have to ask you, what is it like working at The Atlantic?
Well, first of all, thank you for that very nice introduction. And I don't think people will need to have been living under a rock to not know who I am. But I'm grateful to be in this conversation. The Atlantic is kind of an amazing institution. Journalism is this weird industry where, at least in my case, I've been bouncing between these kind of like 100-plus-year-old institutions and then brand new news startups, and they have totally different vibes. And so I came to the Atlantic from one of those startups, and I remember like the first thing I noticed was the offices were kind of like musky and a little dimly lit, and there were like super old leather bound books everywhere. And I remember being like, this is incredible. I mean, the Atlantic is founded in, I think, the 1850s. In the run up to the Civil War, it was an abolitionist publication. And so you really do have this sense of history when you're working there. Like, we now have a new office, but there's this one room. My favorite room in the office is an archive room where you can go in and it has every copy of The Atlantic all the way back to the 19th century. And you can just like peruse it, read about, the Atlantic's coverage of World War One or, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And you really get this kind of incredible sense of being one small part of this institution that has been trying to, you know, provide light to the world for, 160 years.
Did it feel at all intimidating when you started?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yes, definitely. I mean, when I joined, I think I started my conversations with the editors there when I was 29 years old. I had covered a couple presidential campaigns and they had, followed my work, but like I was very much a relatively new person, a new political writer, somebody with not a ton of experience compared to the many esteemed writers who are working there now or have written there over the years. But also, I've gotten really lucky in my career to primarily work with people who are genuinely kind, generous people. And the climate at the Atlantic that's been cultivated over the course of, I think, its whole institutional history, but certainly by the current regime of editors, is really collaborative and positive and geared toward helping younger writers develop skills, improve their writing. And the thing I loved best about The Atlantic is I had been on the political beat for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years by the time I came to the Atlantic. And they wanted me to cover politics, but they also said, we want to create room for you to follow your curiosities. That's like a very Atlantic phrase that we hear a lot. They want the writers to follow their curiosities, meaning if there's something kind of off your typical area of coverage, but that you're just really passionate about or really interested in, follow it and dig into it, and we'll give you time and space to look into it because they generally believe that that will produce the best writing, the best journalism. And that's kind of how I've ended up writing about religion so much at The Atlantic.
That is so cool. This leads me to a question about keeping that creative, open, curious mind as an intellectual and writer, and staying in a somewhat traditional fixed mindset church. I mean, I love that President Nelson is talking about this ongoing restoration. I think also this church is steeped in tradition. So, how do you navigate that balance of
Yeah.
thinking for?
Well, it's funny because I remember when I was, sorry to answer your question with a story about my teenage years, but I promise it's relevant. I remember when I was like 15, 16, that's when I first took an interest in journalism. I had actually been writing since I was in like first or second grade. I wanted to be a writer, but journalism became a point of fixation for me when I was in high school. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. And I went to some kind of workshop for high school journalists where they had people from the Boston Globe. I grew up in Massachusetts. They had people from the Boston Globe there. And I remember one of them was saying, to be a journalist, you have to be skeptical. You have to be the one who is kind of standing apart from the rest of the crowd and asking the annoying question that nobody else is asking. And it's funny because as a journalist, as like an aspiring journalist, I found the appeal in that. But then as a Latter-day Saint, I was like, but I don't want to be the one asking the annoying question. I had this like sense of myself as I have to be like the good all-American, clean cut, polite young man who makes people feel good and doesn't ask skeptical questions and doesn't rock the boat. And I felt like there was a tension between those two identities. And I remember when I was going through this kind of searching period, wondering if I could have a career in journalism while also having a career in this church, I brought it up with my dad. And my dad, who has nothing to do with journalism or the media or anything, had a really good answer. He said, well, one way you could think about it is that journalism at its best is about pursuing truth. And that's also what the gospel is about. So and it's funny because I brought this up with him more recently, and he doesn't remember this conversation at all. But it's one of those moments that was like a light bulb flicked on for me, and I like realized like, oh, I can do this thing. I could be both, right? And that's kind of how I've always thought about it. I think that you're right that the church is steeped in tradition. Some people find that tradition rigid or constraining. I've never felt that way. I feel like the traditions are there to support a gospel that is about searching for truth. And to the extent that I'm doing the best version of my work, it's about the same thing. And so that's how I've always kind of reconciled those two ideas.
I love that. And I'm thinking of a quote from that article I mentioned, The Most American Religion. You quoted David Foster Wallace, who once wrote, "There's always a Mormon around when you don't want one, trying your patience with unsolicited kindness."
Yes.
Do you ever feel like in your professional circle, you are that unwanted Mormon in the room?
It's an interesting question. No, I've never felt like I was unwanted because of my religion. In fact, and I think this is an important point to make because there are probably people listening or watching who are wondering like what it would be like to be in the national media as a practicing Latter-day Saint. And I will say that in my experience, I've been in mostly East Coast, highly secular newsrooms in New York City and Washington, D.C. And in all the newsrooms I've worked in, with just a couple of small exceptions, there have been exceptions, but for the most part, people are very gracious about my religion. They're curious about it. For the most part, newsrooms are not very faith-filled places. So it is true that most of my colleagues have not been very religious people, but they're interested, right? And I think journalists dispositionally are curious, and so they ask questions, they want to know more, but they always come at it from an open-minded place. And so in that way, I've never felt out of place totally because of my religion. I mean, I certainly have felt out of place, but not because anybody is like persecuting me. Dispositionally though, like the that kind of thing that David Foster Wallace is describing that I think is a stereotype but also kind of true, that Mormons are like conditioned to be like overly earnest and smiley and friendly and nodding and laughing along to encourage people, you know, that kind of like missionary affect almost. I definitely have felt that that part of my personality makes me stand out a little bit in certain circles. I remember when I my first job was an internship at Newsweek magazine in New York. And this was in 2010. And people who lived in New York in 2010 will remember this was the Mad Men era. So Mad Men was on TV. Every young man like around my age or a little bit older in that newsroom was wearing like slim cut suits and skinny ties and speaking in like kind of understated, like quasi ironic tones. And I remember like wanting so bad to be like them. I was like, those guys are so cool. Like those guys are they're like great writers and they're so smart and they're like above it all. And like I probably tried to act like that a little bit and realized it just didn't fit. And so, yeah, I think that my Mormonness probably comes through and makes me feel a little or look or be a little strange in certain circles. Media is a very cynical place. Washington and New York are in some ways very cynical places, but it hasn't held me back in my career. If anything, I think it's actually helped me.
Sort of endearing, perhaps.
I hope so. You'd have to ask my coworkers. Maybe they would say annoying and endearing, but I don't know.
Does some of that cynicism ever rub off on you?
Yeah, that I mean that actually I think is the hardest part, and I don't think this is specific to being a person of faith in journalism. I think covering politics, especially in the period that I've been covering it, the last, 10, 15 years, it's hard not to get cynical. It's been a period where we've seen a lot of bad behavior, a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of people sacrificing their principles and stated values in pursuit of kind of cold, hard power. And there is a temptation to be cynical. I think maybe the kind of nadir of my like optimism about politics probably came like 5 or 6 years ago. But I think I realized that I was at risk of becoming too cynical. And I actually don't think cynicism is a good trait in journalism, in writing, and literature, in politics. I think that skepticism is good. And I do think that, especially if you're a journalist, but really any kind of writer or observer of human life, like you should try to put yourself somewhat at a remove and be skeptical and ask those annoying questions that I was told to ask when I was 15 years old. But there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism. And I think with cynicism, there is a risk of becoming kind of fatalistic about politics, about American democracy, about whatever it is you cover, that kind of curdles your writing and your worldview and ends up turning you into a force that's advancing the things that you don't like, you know? I'm speaking very abstractly, so I'll put this in more concrete terms. Like one thing that I think has happened to a lot of people who cover politics in the last 10 years is that we have decided collectively, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, that people who are in politics, politicians, office holders, are all at their core bad people. That they're all like that, if you really scraped away all the artifice and dug up all their secrets, you'd find that they're all bad people, they're all snakes, they're all dishonest, they're all hypocrites. And because of that, you should just vote for the people who are closest to your preferred policies and not expect anything more from them. And that is a cynical attitude that is born of a lot of, real data points. Like I understand why people feel that way. But I think that what ends up happening if you adopt that attitude is that you basically create a permission structure for people in power to behave badly because they look at this and they say, "Oh, look, voters, journalists, they don't expect me to be a good person. And so I don't need to try to be a good person. They don't hold me to high ethical or moral standards, so I don't need to hold myself to those standards." And so I have tried really hard with myself and with others and in my work to not sacrifice my kind of earnestness, idealism, optimism about American politics, public servants at the altar of being like savvy. I think that is a real like epidemic in our industry, and it's something that I've tried to push back against.
How do you do that?
I don't know. I mean, you have to, it starts with yourself and your own writing and punditry. Writing is the thing that I spend most of my time and energy on, but I also, go on podcasts and TV and I'm on Twitter to my eternal chagrin. I should definitely get off Twitter. And all writers, if you're not addicted to a social media platform now, please just don't get addicted to one. It is the source of so much distraction. But, I just try to check myself. Like you constantly have to be examining your own premises. And when I find myself, starting from a premise that's cynical, you question yourself. It's also a matter of like looking for good examples or complicated examples. So I write a lot of profiles. That's one of my kind of main things that I do. At The Atlantic, I profile people in power. And I always find I'm not really drawn to subjects who are, heroic, like who seem like they're heroes. And I don't really love profiling straightforward villains either. First, because I guess, and this probably is born of my faith, but like I don't really believe anybody is actually just a hero or a villain. We're all complicated people. And so I try to find that complicatedness in my writing. And so I tend to be drawn to subjects who are caught in the tension between their ambitions and their principles. And examining that tension is really important, and like the conditions that create that tension, the incentives that create that tension, but also finding people who find themselves on the right side of that tension ultimately, who make the right choice, I think is really important. That's part of what made Mitt Romney an interesting subject to me. He's not perfect, he's very complicated, and he would be the first to admit that he's made a lot of mistakes in his life. But, at key moments in this last chapter of his career, he's done what he thought was right, even when all the political incentives were pulling him in the other direction. And, spending time writing a book about somebody like that will help cure you of your cynicism.
Was it your idea to write that book?
It was. I approached him about it. So he's a weird character in my journalism career because I feel like I've been writing about Mitt Romney forever. In fact, I forgot this and then remembered it last year as I was doing interviews for my book. I wrote about him in 2004 when I was in high school. I went to cover the Republican National Convention in New York City where Mitt Romney gave a speech. And so I covered his speech there. So I've really been covering him my entire journalism career, basically. I covered his presidential campaign when I was a young reporter, his 2012 campaign. And then when he got to Washington as a senator, I profiled him for The Atlantic. Um, that's when I actually started to get to know him. And so I approached him in 2021, just not long after January 6th, actually, the riot at the Capitol, where Mitt Romney had been during all of that. And I had this sense that he might be in an interesting headspace where he might be ready to kind of talk about what he had experienced and the lessons it had taught him and all of that. And much to my luck, he was in that headspace and he decided that he was ready to kind of tell his whole story. He had not really written a full, proper political memoir about his time in office. And so I basically said, instead of writing your own book, why don't you let me write a biography of you and give me full access and also let me have editorial control over the book, which was kind of like an audacious ask. But I just felt like as a journalist, it wouldn't be right for me to write an authorized biography in the sense that he got to kind of edit it and take things out. And to his credit, he decided to do it. And he said, I thought about this and I don't think I can be objective about my own life. So I'm going to trust you to kind of write this story. And so yeah, I ended up spending 2.5 years working on it. And it was my idea, but it was ultimately very much a collaboration because we spent so much time together over those 2 years. I think I did over 40 interviews when all was said and done.
What was your daily process like for that? I just would love to know more about your writing process. Do you have certain disciplines day to day, certain windows of time you reserve only for writing, that you cut out the distractions of social media?
Yeah, my wife would laugh at that question because she probably wishes I had more discipline in my process. So books are slightly different because at least in my case, I take a leave from the Atlantic to write my book. So, and the Atlantic is very generous about that. They basically say, okay, tell us how many months you need. You can leave and we'll hold your spot while you're writing your book and then you can come back. But really, whether it's writing a long form magazine article or a book, the process is sort of the same for the writing. I've known writers who wake up at 5 a.m. and go for a run and then sit at their desk and write for 6 hours uninterrupted. And I wish that I did that, but I just can't. I am a late night writer. I spend basically the day making phone calls, doing meetings, attending to my other tasks, email and TV and podcasts, whatever. And sometimes I'll be able to really get going in the late afternoon if I can like put my phone somewhere else in the room and turn off the internet, I can really kind of bear down. But I probably get my most productive writing done after I put my kids to bed. So like around 9 p.m., I'll sit down at my desk and 9 to like 1 in the morning is where I get most of my writing done. It's terrible. I wish that I could figure out some other system, but I've just never reliably gotten into a habit of writing during the day. I think I'm too distracted and kind of addled. And then also, like, there's something about late at night. I don't know. I want to hear about your process, Jenna, but like, I feel like there's something about late at night where you know that like everybody else is asleep. There's really nothing else you can attend to. And also wanting to go to bed and being like, I just need to finish, this section or write this many more words before I can go to bed that like forces me to finally like focus and get writing done. What
Oh,
is your process?
McKay, this is giving me so much hope. I
Why?
am a late night writer,
Oh, you
so
are.
just to fill people in, I'm an aspiring writer. I've written a manuscript. It's with an agent right now. It's a memoir about my work as a prison chaplain. And so, yeah, I mean, I work during the day as a chaplain, and it's so consuming in a good way. I love it. All my energy is going into that, and I get home and I try to reset, have some dinner, sometimes take a short nap, and that's when, in the evening, that's when the writing has to happen. And I keep thinking like there's got to be a way that I can go to bed at 9 and wake up at 4 and do
Yeah.
writing before my work as a chaplain. But for me, it just has not happened. So I have hope, okay, hearing this from you.
Well, it's funny because I have an editor at The Atlantic who she's like edited all the great writers who have come through The Atlantic in the last, 10 years or whatever. And I was telling her, I remember early on, like, I'm going to try to change my process. I'm going to, start getting up super early and writing then or whatever. And she was like, look, try whatever you want. But in my experience, writers kind of know when the best time is to write. And if you're a good writer, or even if you're just producing writing, don't mix it, don't change it up too much. Like that's kind of just that's your default setting is probably what's going to work best.
This is so helpful. And I've noticed for me, oftentimes when I try to go to bed early and do it, quote, the right way that I think is right or better, that's when all the ideas come. It's when all the
Hmm.
creativity turns on. And I sometimes feel like this divine download of ideas and information. And in some ways, it feels very sacred. And so I'm like, okay, I must get out of bed. I must write
Yeah.
what God is giving me right now.
Yeah, I really do think like whatever works for you is what works. I will say like once you start to have other people like I mean I have four kids and my wife like that part of it is complicated, but also that's why late night writing is great because it can kind of accommodate like any living situation, whether you have a job or a family, whatever. Like at some point everybody goes to sleep. Your boss goes to sleep, your family goes to sleep, and so like late night is a good time to write. Anyway,
Do
that's
you,
my
do
spiel.
you, McKay, get sleep eventually? Like at
Yeah,
1 a.m., you get sleep.
yeah, I was gonna say, so when I was a younger man, I would pull all-nighters a lot. That was the danger of the late night writing. Like I would get going at like 9 or 10 p.m. and then I would kind of get into this like manic state of writing and it would go until, I'd look up and it was like 4:30 in the morning and then I'd be like, well, if it's already 4:30, there's no point in going to bed if I have to wake up at 7 or whatever. So then I would go the whole night. I don't recommend that. Doctors would not recommend it. It's not good for your health. And I reached a point where I realized the writing I was doing at like 4 or 5 in the morning was not the best. And then you're like exhausted. Anyway, the real thing is I got too old for that. Like I feel like I got to my 30s and my body was like, no, you can't do this anymore. And so I try to be done by like 1 in the morning. And then if I can sleep into like 7, 8, then that's like enough time. My wife is very nice and tries to let me, when she knows that we've gotten into this routine where I'll get into bed at whatever time and I'll send her a text. Her phone is like, off, but I'll send her a text to be like, getting to bed at 2:30 or getting to bed at 1:30 or whatever. And then she'll try to let me sleep in. But we also have a baby now. So, the sleep is not as plentiful as we would like. But we also know that this is like it's a brief period of our lives where your kids are young and want to wake you up in the morning, and so we try to savor that.
Yes, I love that. Savor that season.
Yes.
And the writing will come and flow as
Yes.
you keep showing up. I want to ask you about the spiritual side of things for you, McKay. How does your relationship with God influence the work that you do as an artist?
Yeah. Well, I love the way that you described the kind of period of inspiration as in religious context, right? Because I do feel like there is a relationship between creative inspiration and divine inspiration or religious inspiration, spiritual inspiration. I have made a habit of before I like sit down to write, I say a prayer and ask for help and kind of thinking clearly and to be able to kind of channel the gifts that I've been given in the best way possible. When I give speeches or before I go on TV or a podcast, I say a prayer and ask that I'll be able to tell the truth. And that again, that's like because journalism is so wrapped up in my mind with my religious life in a lot of ways, like just in the sense that truth is at the bottom of each of them. I always ask for divine help there. But then I also feel like, part of what I've been really lucky to be able to do as a writer is to like write about our faith and this church, Mormonism, from a perch that is not always available to members of our church, writing for a national magazine. And I've been really lucky to have a couple of editors. I can think of three at The Atlantic who are really invested in helping me and encouraging me to tell those stories. The Atlantic sees itself as a magazine of diverse perspectives in all meanings of that word. When it was founded, not to give you too much of a history lesson here, the founders of The Atlantic said that we as a publication would be of no party or clique. And the way that we try to translate that idea today is by having writers from across the political spectrum, from across the socioeconomic spectrum, and from all different walks of religious life writing for the magazine. And so you mentioned that piece, The Most American Religion, and I'm so grateful to hear from people like you who say that it meant something to them because it was a real labor of love for me. And Also something that stressed me out a lot when I was kind of first undertaking it, because these editors came to me, Jeff Goldberg in particular, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. He had been wanting me for years to write a long-form exploration of Mormonism. He was just fascinated by it. He's fascinated by religion in general, especially Latter-day Saints. And he said, you got to write about this. And for a while, I almost kind of resisted that because I was just worried about like not being able to represent the faith well. And also, I knew that if I was going to write about it, I'd be doing it as a journalist, which meant that I would have to write a story that was complicated, right? And that wasn't necessarily something that would like appear in the Liahona, right? And I just wondered, like, do I want to do this? And ultimately, what I realized was if I didn't write it, they would find somebody else to write it. And maybe not somebody from our background, maybe not somebody who has kind of the experience with lived religion, who is like gone to early morning seminary or served a mission or, knows what it's like to go to a like sweaty youth stake dance. And, like those were the things that I could bring to the table. I think a lot of journalists could have written a good piece about the tensions within Mormonism and the history and all of that. A lot of journalists could have done a good job of interviewing President Nelson, as I was able to do. But I was able to bring my own experience. And when I finally sat down to start writing, my editors told me, like, don't shy away from the personal, like, lean into that stuff, both because it'll be more authentic and true to who you are, and also it's more honest to the readers. If you don't try to hide your kind of biases, but instead just weave it into your work and say, look, this is who I am. I was raised in this faith. I'm still a practicing member of this faith. Also, I'm able to see somewhat clearly that there are tensions and that it's difficult and there are issues the church is trying to address with younger members and LGBTQ members, and there are chapters in our history pertaining to race and other things that make a lot of people uncomfortable and that are a legacy the church is still dealing with. And I can write about all of that, but not from a place of cynicism to kind of bring our conversation full circle, but from a place of hope and optimism and journalistic skepticism. Like you can do all of it together. And I'm really grateful for that help from my editors and that encouragement from my editors. And I think I'm grateful that I was able to kind of weave those things together in a way that felt authentic to me. I don't claim to represent everybody, I think a lot of different people have a lot of different experiences, including you, Jenna. And I do think that, I attribute my ability to be able to do that to my relationship with God and to the gifts that He's given me.
Amen to that. McKay, I could talk to you all day. I know you have to leave in 2 minutes. I have one last question. What would you say to someone who feels called to do something similar to what you're doing, to come from an LDS perspective and speak to a mostly not LDS audience?
I would strongly encourage them to follow that instinct. If there's one complaint I have about being a Latter-day Saint in this environment is that there's just not enough of us. Part of what makes me hesitate to write about Mormonism, Mormon issues, whatever, is that I don't always feel like I'm the right Mormon voice to take on every issue. Or I sometimes worry that people will read what I wrote and think that that is the definitive Mormon take on X issue. And the reality is, the church is diverse and there's a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds and experiences. And I would like to see all of those reflected in the national media. And whether that's in journalism or in literature or in Hollywood or music, I mean, Hollywood, we could use a lot more Latter-day Saints creating in that space. But really, like, I just would encourage it. I think that for those of us who are already here, we would be really lucky to have more voices. And then one other thing, because I'll just head this off, because this was a concern that I remember having when I was young. And I went to BYU, I studied journalism, and there was a lot of concern among people who were thinking about careers in journalism about whether you could like live a, you know, traditionally Latter-day Saint life while pursuing a field like journalism or writing or whatever. Like can you support a family? Can you have kids and have time for a calling and go to church and all that stuff? And like in my experience, the answer has been yes. And I think that actually people overestimate how impossible it is to kind of have a family while working in the arts. But I would also say that you don't need to make the arts your full-time career either, right? Like this can be something that you do on the side. You can be working on a book while you have a day job. You can be creating podcasts or writing your screenplay or whatever while you have another job. Like the great thing about the creative economy is that it doesn't have to be a 9 to 5 for you to find fulfillment in it and for you to have success in it. And so I would just encourage anybody who feels kind of called to that path to take it seriously and to explore it, and also to reach out because I'm always happy to help or offer any advice that I can.
McKay Coppins, thank you so much. Thank you for your trailblazing work, for your bridge building, and for your time today. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us and being part of this creative community. I want to thank the LDS PMA podcast team for giving me the opportunity to host and interview one of my very favorite role models. If you enjoyed this interview, be sure to tune into more episodes of Season 5, where a variety of guest hosts will be interviewing some of their favorite creators who have a wealth of wisdom to share about their creative journey. Thank you so much. Until next time.